I want to tell you about Sylvia Orent. I've been sitting with this episode for a while, longer than the others, because this one doesn't end the way I expected it to, and I think it's important that I'm honest with you about that from the start. This is the Voss inheritance. My name is Cassandra Maddox, and over the next several episodes, I'll be walking you through one of the most quietly unsettling mysteries I've ever come across. A dead woman, a fortune with nowhere to go, and a circle of people who all seem to have made the same decision: to disappear. In episode 2, I told you that Sylvia Orent was the one person connected to this case who hadn't disappeared, one of 3 members of Garner Street Partners, a name on a document that tied directly to Eleanor Voss, to Victor Aldrich Crane, and to a $40 million foundation built on silence. Everyone else in this case, Preston Hale, Gordon Voss, Miriam Cho, they all made themselves impossible to find. Sylvia stayed. Same address on the west side of the city she'd had for over 20 years. Listed in the phone directory. Visible. I drove to her house on a Thursday afternoon. I never got to knock on the door. Let me tell you what I found when I started digging into Sylvia Orent's background, because what I found is not what I expected. On the surface, Sylvia Orent had a life, a real, visible, documented life. She was a licensed urban planner who spent 22 years working for a mid-sized consulting firm in the city. She had a professional profile. She had her name on published city development reports from the late 1990s and early 2000s. She had a LinkedIn page, sparse but present. She owned her home outright, purchased in 1994. By every visible measure, Sylvia Orent was exactly what she appeared to be, a quietly accomplished professional woman in her late 60s, living a modest, unremarkable life on the west side of the city. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed something. Her public presence was perfectly curated, not in the way of someone who simply didn't use social media, in the way of someone who had thought carefully about exactly how much of themselves to make visible. Every professional record was legitimate, every document checked out, but there was nothing personal, no family mentioned anywhere, no friends tagged in anything, no community involvement beyond her professional work. It was a life constructed to look normal, without ever revealing anything real. And then I noticed something else. 3 of the city development reports her firm had published between 1997 and 2002. Reports she was listed as a contributing analyst on involved properties in the Garner Street district, the same district where the Aldrich Endowment's P.O. box was registered, the same district where the building was demolished in 2004. Sylvia Orent hadn't just signed a business filing with Victor Aldrich Crane and G. Voss. She had spent years professionally embedded in the same geographic area that sat at the center of this entire case. The consulting firm Sylvia worked for was called Meridian Urban Group. It dissolved in 2009. 6 years after Eleanor's death, 5 years after the Garner Street building came down. I pulled Meridian's dissolution filing, standard paperwork, nothing unusual on the surface. But Meridian Urban Group had a parent company, a holding entity that owned a majority stake in the firm from 1995 onward. That holding entity was registered in Delaware, which makes its ownership structure difficult to trace. But the registered agent listed on the original Delaware filing was a law firm, Preston Hale's law firm. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Sylvia Orent's employer for over 2 decades was majority owned by a holding company whose registered agent was the same lawyer who drafted Eleanor Voss's will and then vanished 2 weeks after it was filed. Sylvia wasn't peripheral to this case. She was woven into its infrastructure. Her entire professional life, her visible, legitimate, carefully constructed professional life, existed within a network that Preston Hale had helped build. She didn't stay because she was uninvolved. She stayed because she was protected, or because she believed she was. I went back to those 3 Garner Street development reports, the ones Sylvia had contributed to between 1997 and 2002. The first 2 were routine, assessments of commercial zoning, infrastructure capacity, development potential, the kind of reports cities commission constantly and file away and never look at again. The third one was different. It was dated March 2002, 18 months before Eleanor died. It was an assessment of a single property, the building at 1109 Garner Street. The building that housed the Aldrich Endowment's P.O. box. The building that would be demolished 2 years later. The report recommended the building for expedited demolition on the grounds of structural deficiency. The same grounds cited in the 2004 demolition permit, but the report was dated 2002. 2 years before the demolition was approved. 2 years before anyone publicly knew the building needed to come down. Sylvia Orent wrote the recommendation that would eventually be used to erase the Aldrich Endowment's only physical address. And she wrote it 2 years before Eleanor Voss was dead. The demolition wasn't reactive. It was scheduled, just like the foundation, just like the inheritance. Every piece of this had been planned, and Sylvia Orent had been one of the people doing the planning. I drove to her house that Thursday with a list of questions I didn't expect her to answer. I just wanted to see her face when I asked them. I parked 2 houses down at 3:40 in the afternoon. Her car was in the driveway, a gray sedan, current registration sticker. The lights inside were off, but it was still daylight. Nothing looked wrong. I sat there for about 10 minutes, going over my notes one more time. At 3:52, a neighbor came out of the house directly across the street. An older man, moving quickly. He didn't look at me. He went to Sylvia's front door and knocked again. Then he took out his phone and made a call. By 4:15, there were 2 police cars on the street. I didn't approach. I watched from my car as officers went inside. I watched the body language of the people coming back out. I watched the neighbor sit on his own front steps with his head in his hands. I drove home and spent 3 hours confirming what I already knew had happened. Sylvia Orent was found in her living room armchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes open. The neighbor, who had a spare key and checked on her twice a week, had noticed her car hadn't moved since Tuesday. The medical examiner's preliminary finding was cardiac arrest, natural causes. She was 71 years old. Eleanor Voss was found in her bedroom armchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes open, cardiac arrest, natural causes, 74 years old. Sylvia Orent was found in her living room armchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes open, cardiac arrest, natural causes, 71 years old. I'm not a medical examiner. I cannot tell you that Sylvia Orent was murdered. What I can tell you is that 2 women, both connected to the same network, both holding knowledge that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to contain, died in identical circumstances, in identical positions, with identical rulings. And I can tell you this, in the days since Sylvia's death, I have been careful. more careful than I was before Thursday. Because here's what I keep coming back to. Miriam Cho disappeared. Preston Hale disappeared. Gordon Voss disappeared. The Voss children went silent. These were people who knew something, and they made themselves invisible. Sylvia Orent didn't disappear. She stayed visible. She stayed present. She seemed protected. And she died the same way Eleanor died, which means either the protection ran out, or it was never real to begin with. I have one thread left from Sylvia's life that I haven't pulled yet, a name that appeared in her personal property records. Not a business connection, not a professional contact, a personal one. The name is familiar. It appeared once before in this case, in a context I dismissed at the time as coincidence. I don't think it was a coincidence. I'll tell you what I found next time. This is the Voss inheritance. If you're still here, you're one of the curious ones. Stick around. The next mystery's already waiting.